So we're recording the meeting, and I would like to introduce our speaker tonight, who we're very pleased to have. It's Dr. Max Morris and Moritz, and he is a wildfire specialist at the University of California Cooperative Extension, where he's been for almost 2 decades. He is currently an adjunct professor at the Bren School at UC Santa Barbara. He analyzes fire patterns, including the factors that cause wildfire. Max hopes to apply scientific findings and projections to help us make better decisions about sustainable land use and management of fire-prone landscapes. Dr. Moritz will answer questions at the end of the presentation, but you can send them to me in chat whenever you want. So Max, go for it, sir.
Thank you, thank you. I will hopefully share my screen here.
You are.
All righty. Well, thank you, first of all, for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to share some of our work and thoughts, and also for giving up some of your Wednesday night to be here. I don't come at fire quite the same as many other researchers. I actually come from a biogeography background, so it's a very old field, focused on the study of the patterns of organisms across the planet and what drives their distributions. And so, that's a little bit of a different perspective than many, say, forest fire scientists or paleoclimate folks. Anyway, and here's my email if you want to get in touch with me afterwards, mmoritz@bren.ucsp.edu. We could probably have a really short and not very fulfilling evening and just answer the question in the title and say, well, it's probably going to be a lot more fire prone, more fires, bigger fires, probably more home losses. But what I want to do is talk a little bit about how the evolution of thinking in projecting fire under climate change scenarios, how we do it, and what some of the uncertainties are, because I think that's really important. Because it often gets talked about in very concrete terms. And then also really to focus more on what we're learning about human development patterns and how they play into our thinking and our fire modeling, actually, and how human development patterns and densities also affect our loss patterns of homes and what we can do about that. And so I spent a lot of time on extension as a cooperative extension specialist, trying to get this information out into the public and into legislators' hands, land managers, homeowners, etc. Okay. So with that, and these are the top image here. Both of these are distressing. This is from 2007 in the Angora fire around Lake Tahoe. The bottom one was a neighborhood in Paradise just a couple of years ago in the campfire. Okay. So I think most of you, if you've had any fire talk, if you've witnessed or sat through any fire talk, you've probably seen this triangle, the fire behavior triangle. And this is how traditional fire modeling or how it's taught in our textbooks, what controls the behavior of a given wildfire. And that by behavior, we mean flame lengths, rates of spread, heat release. And that's the fuel, the amount and structure and characteristics of the fuel, the weather, how hot, dry, and windy it is, and then the topography, how steep the terrain is. And those come together, and there's some equations that we can use to predict how a fire might behave. And that makes sense for any given event. But some of us look at fire differently, more like this. And this is just a single year's worth of satellite observations. You can tell the month is down at the bottom. You can see the red marching through the months. And when we first got data sets like this, now we have about 15 years of data, but when we first got data like this, it was kind of stunning. Some of us studying fire realized, wow, we're used to looking at this little segment over here. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but we're, in the Western US. But fire is doing lots of kind of interesting and amazing things, and it's being driven by different factors in different parts of the world. And so that insight or that kind of driven by these data sets, spawned this whole field of study, which has now kind of become known as pyrogeography, really the study of the spatial patterns of fire and what drives them and what their effects are. And that's what my lab and several other labs have focused on quite a bit for the last couple of decades. When we think of a fire regime, instead of an individual event, but a recurrent system of fires, we think about what controls those fires in space and time. And it boils down to three basic bins of controls. And one is something about the fuel accumulation, right? The environmental constraints on biomass productivity. So basically, fire has to burn something, and the variables that drive fuel accumulation turn out to be really useful in projecting fire patterns, recreating the historical ones and projecting into the future. Something about the fire season. So how long, hot, and dry is that window in time when fire can occur, right? There's places that have plenty of fuel, but very, very minimal windows in time in which that fuel is actually flammable, right? So there's a different set of variables that get at the fire season length and severity. And then you got to have ignitions, right, that coincide with all these other suitable conditions. And we've kind of built a framework to help talk about this and understand this. So the resources to burn, the lower right, are the fuel accumulation and patterns that drive productivity. The atmospheric conditions, this is the fire season, and ignitions, right? How those come together give us the kinds and the frequencies of fires that we see in a given place. Well, early on, we were all worried about climate change, and there was a conventional wisdom that it was going to become worse. Fire problems were going to become worse. And there was a paper in 2006, a very prominent and important paper, which looked at fire activity across the Western US, higher elevation Western forests, and made the argument that warmer temperatures, primarily spring temperatures, and that's what we're seeing down here in this lower figure. Spring temperatures and fire activity are the bars. Warmer, and the thinking was that warmer spring temperatures caused earlier snowmelt in these higher elevation forests. With earlier snowmelt, you had a longer window in time in which you have a fire season, right? Earlier spring snowmelt that starts the dry down earlier. And then you have the opportunity for increased fire activity. Well, many of us looking at this, we're excited, but we're also curious. Well, how consistent is this going to be? Is it going to be warmer and more fire activity everywhere? What about precipitation? What about different elevations? What about different ecosystem types? And that spawned a bunch of us to start looking into the relationships that we now understand better. And the tools that we used in my group, we kind of came at it like this, that there's some suitable range of conditions where all of the factors come together and are highly suitable for fire. But then there's also marginal conditions, right? And if you are an ecologist, this also kind of reminds you of a niche of habitat suitability and a niche requirements. And so actually we adopted from other studies species distribution modeling, because about 10 to 15 years ago, species distribution modeling was very new and very powerful, and people were looking at range shifts and extinctions under climate change. And we realized that actually these same tools, if we thought of fire kind of as having a niche, we could use very similar tools to actually produce fire distribution models. And it turned out to work quite well. And so with the emergence of these new data sets, we could look across the whole planet. And this is an image from one of our studies where we're looking at global patterns of fire. These are just fire counts. But we could take these counts and actually make them into inputs for distribution modeling or habitat suitability modeling, and actually quantify which variables were important in which parts of the world. So this is a very complicated, and I just want to make a couple of points with it. The different colors are the input variables to this global model. NPP is net primary productivity. PAN is precipitation annually. P dry, precipitation in the driest month. Temperature seasonality, temperature in the wettest month, and temperature in the warmest month. But what this shows us is that there are different drivers, different constraints and drivers, and how the relative importance of those varies across different parts of the world too. Different biomes, or fire is constrained by different variables in different biomes, not surprisingly. And so we learned a lot about why different biomes seem to be fire prone or fire limited. We were able to project into the future. And this is from a study where we had 18, it's either 16 or 18 global climate models. And we projected them all forward and then took the mean of all of them, right? And so here are mean expected changes in the near term and the far term. And then we also took kind of an IPCC approach, which is looking at model agreement. Instead of taking the mean, they would take just how many of those 16 models even agreed on there being an increase or a decrease in fire in these time periods. And actually, this shows some pretty interesting patterns too. It shows that as you go further and further out in time, there's more and more agreement. In the near term, though, it showed that the models really didn't even agree on an increase in fire or a decrease in fire in over half the planet. So we've learned a lot more since then, but these were some of our first attempts at projecting fire using climatic variables into the future. Again, another look at how it shifts in the biomes with time, near term and far term. And really what we kind of came away with is that there's a first order gradient in fire probabilities and fire frequencies and fire activity. And that it's driven primarily by this hump-shaped response of fire to productivity, to the amount of resources that there are to burn. In our very sparsely, our deserts, places that are very unproductive, there's very little fire. It rises rapidly. It has a long, flat plateau area, and then it actually drops in the highest productivity areas like our tropical rainforests. And along this primary gradient, there are other variables, there are other sensitivities that come into play in driving fire either up or down away from this sort of dominant primary gradient. Anyway, this gave us gave us a framework for how to think about this, how to explain it, and how to model it. Since then, there's been a lot of projections like this, and we've started to look at different ways to compare the future, because there are uncertainties, and this is one way to get at them. Instead of using an ensemble mean, you could take the warm, wet futures and the warm, dry futures and contrast them against each other, right? And if you're going to do, say, a climate change adaptation planning exercise, you might look at a variety of possible futures and see if your adaptation planning accommodates all of them, only a few of them, anyway. And what we see this is for the Mediterranean basin. It looks fairly similar for California's Mediterranean systems. Basically, the warmer and drier areas in the Mediterranean are going to see less fire in the southern portions, the more poleward parts of the Mediterranean basin, and the more mesic, currently more mesic, wetter areas. As it gets drier in the future, you will see more fire in the northern areas. And with a warmer, wetter future, you see the exact opposite. So this really shows an important take-home message, and that's that it matters, or it can matter a lot, which future we actually realize in how fire may change across any given landscape. Now, after doing this for a bunch of different parts of the world, we started honing in on our own backyard. This is California, several decades worth of fire, the little orange blobs. And we started realizing at finer and finer scales, those are the Jepsen ecoregions too, the different colored regions. We started realizing that at finer scales, we can't tell the whole story just with the biophysical variables, just with the variables that drive the productivity rates and the fire season length and severity. Because as you get to finer scales, humans and what we're doing on the landscape start to show up as very important. As an example, here's a map of power line infrastructure across California, right? And as we all know, in recent years, we've had a lot of discussion and hand-wringing over the utility role in fires. But it turns out that when you go to a finer scale, like the global models that we were looking at a while ago are on the order of 50 to 100 kilometers per grid cell. So they're very coarse spatial scale. These are like on the order of a kilometer in spatial resolution. So as you get finer and finer, you really have to pull humans and what we're doing on the landscape into the models. And this is not this is a graphic which tries to make this point conceptually that basically, these are coupled human natural systems, right? Sometimes they're called socio-ecological systems, but basically we have naturally fire-prone systems here doing their thing, and we have the wildland-urban interface where human communities come into contact and build our homes and live our lives, and how these systems come together. If we're going to look at them together, if we're going to model them, we have to have a more synthetic, holistic view of how this comes together, and that's been at the basis of a lot of our more recent work. Well, it turns out when you build models to project fire at the scale of California, you can break the models into the sets of variables, the biophysical contribution set of variables, and that's what we're seeing here on the left-hand side. That's how fire probabilities, and that's what we're looking at in the maps, fire probabilities vary according to the natural variables. Now, the human variables give us a really different picture. These are variables like roadedness of an area, housing densities, distance to public lands, and things like this. And what we see is that actually the anthropogenic variables in these models can drive fire up or down. We can have more frequent fire, more fire in the landscape. Those are the reds. Or we can develop the landscape in such a way that we actually drive fire activity down. And that's actually a really interesting insight. And one of the things from this particular paper, we learned that actually the human contribution across the landscape to fire probabilities is on par with the climate variables. Now that's actually a really important insight, because that means as climate is changing and we continue to struggle with that, we actually have some tools in the toolkit through land use and other policy changes to develop differently on the landscape and actually have a potentially different future than we would if we didn't try to control and guide that in a more sensible way. This responsiveness of fire to human development kind of has a hump-shaped response. It's flatter in some areas than others. It's more peaked in some areas. We have some new work coming out right now that confirms this, that basically there's again, it's sort of a hump-shaped response to a variety of human development variables. And the storyline is that you have some background level of fire on a landscape, and then as you develop that, you put more and more people, more and more ignitions on the landscape. You continue to develop that, and you kind of saturate the landscape at some point, and that's this peak at the top. And then you continue to develop, and you actually push fire activity down, right? You've fragmented the natural landscape. You have roads, you have organized fire suppression. It's culturally unacceptable to burn leaves in your yard. You basically have more and more urban areas, and fire plays a smaller and smaller role. So we've also learned then that we have to take our sort of conceptual framework and break it into the human and biophysical and try to model this and quantify this a little more carefully. But the key take home here is that human development and human influence is really, you have to have them in your model at finer scales, or you're not going to make projections that are very realistic. And again, another example of that, here's the Bay Area. This is the effect in the models due to the biophysical variables. And again, the effect in the models due to the strength of the anthropogenic variables. And again, human development drives not only our exposure, right? Because where we build on the landscape dictates how many of our homes actually might come in contact with fire or vice versa. But it actually feeds back to affect fire probabilities themselves. That's really an important insight. Okay, who's using some of this? I'm actually very fortunate in that CAL FIRE has taken some of our fire probability models and they actually use them in their carbon accounting program for making grants to projects whose goals are avoided emissions, basically. If we can talk about that later if we want. It's a little bit complicated, but these maps actually underpin a lot of their decision making. They also go into the fire hazard severity zone maps. There's going to be an update to the fire hazard severity zone maps that CAL FIRE produces, and these guide building codes up and down the state. Okay, what don't we do well? I think it's as important to acknowledge that as maybe anything. This is a map of Santa Ana wind corridors shown in darker and darker red. This is from a study that I did several years ago. Basically, a lot of these models, we don't have good wind data. We just don't have extreme wind patterns resolved and mapped in a way that would make it useful for helping out our models. And we know that's incredibly important. So winds, most of these models are built on climate norms, so 30-year or so average variables or averages for the variables. But we also know interannual variability, right? Drought swings in precip from one year to the next are really important when you're looking at finer and finer scales. Or other extremes like last year's, a rash of lightning storms in the middle of the summer that coincided with heat waves, right? Those are extreme events that don't show up in the norms, the long-term averages. And we really need to get those into our models. The reason we haven't been doing it up until now is we didn't really trust the global climate models, the GCMs, to very realistically produce patterns of those interannual variability sequences or the extremes. But that's improving. A real omission is that we have very few projections of plausible human development patterns on the landscape in the future, right? We have dozens of labs working to produce future climate projections. But we've learned that actually human development patterns are just as important, at least in the fire frequency models we're doing. And we have almost none of those to use in our future projections, and we really do need those. Lastly, I'll just touch on, there is a debate and there is a series of things that we can learn from statistical models that we can't learn from what we would call process-based models. So an example of that, or example of that dichotomy or that, I don't call it a debate, but that difference. It's very hard to model future vegetation patterns well based on statistical models because there's lots of feedbacks, fire, beetles, et cetera, et cetera. It's easier to model fire with statistical models, but to do a good job on vegetation patterns, we tend to rely on process-based models, and we really don't have a good idea of which forests or which vegetation types are going to shift to where, right? We think most of them are going to shift uphill. There's another study kind of looking at that. This is the Sierras, the mapped domains you see here. And these are transitions between different forest types and other vegetation types in these landscapes or on these landscapes. And in general, they are moving uphill with warmer conditions. And this is just one GCM, one climate model showing this. But we really need to get a better handle on this so we can understand. And fire is not in these models. This is all climate habitat suitability. Yeah, we really need to get a better idea of what's potentially transitioning to where, so we know how to best spend our resources on these landscapes. Okay, I'm going to shift gears here a little bit and talk about kind of some extension challenges that I have run into. It's all related to this, these questions that we've been talking about. But basically, it's about the perception of wildfire as being kind of a simple monolithic problem, right? Often we hear people talking about the wildfire crisis, the wildfire problem, and to me, this is so general that it actually lacks any usefulness, right? I really have found, and I argue this with some passion, that we have to be very careful and specific about which problem we're talking about here, so we know what we're trying to fix. And I think we talk past each other a lot because we're actually not talking about the same thing sometimes. And here's a narrative that's, for me, sort of epitomizes this problem where we're not speaking about the same issues and we don't necessarily have the same shared assumptions. And I hear this narrative from journalists, from politicians, from my neighbors, colleagues, and it goes something like this. We have an increasing fire activity due to climate change, right? And there's good scientific evidence backing this notion. And that's going to lead to more severe forest fires, right? And there is actually good scientific evidence backing this linkage too. But then the story keeps going and it says, well, with more climate change and more forest fires, we're going to have more home losses. And I think some of us studying these patterns start to, say, hey, time out, wait a minute, that connection we need to think about. And then, of course, more disasters, right? With more home losses, we have the potential for more of these urban conflagrations that we've seen. And I really think it's worth parsing this out a little bit and looking at this. Is this really a cause and effect or a causal chain of impacts and events? Because one of the things that many people have noticed when you look at the environments after a fire sweeps through and there's been a lot of home losses, and if we were in a class, we would try to raise hands or take a poll or something, but we're not. But one of the things that we've noticed over and over is that the vegetation around the homes is often unburned. And this is a very consistent, it's not 100%, but it's a very consistent thing that you'll notice when you look at neighborhoods that have burned or homes that have burned. And it actually highlights something very important about what's going on here. These homes are not burning from a forest next to them, catching that home on fire. It's burning during a wind-driven event when embers penetrate the building envelope and catch the home on fire. And then it becomes a home to home to home, often domino effect, where these homes are burning, creating huge amounts of heat and embers and catching the rest of the homes in the neighborhood on fire. So first of all, no, it's not necessarily more forest fires leading to more homes. These are due to wind-driven events blowing embers at the home from potentially relatively far away. And most home losses, if you quantify this, most home losses are not in what we would think of as traditional forests, right? This is in the wildland-urban interface. It's not necessarily in a mixed conifer forest where we picture a forest fire happening. So which problem are we really tackling or trying to tackle? And I argue that, we at least have two that we can break out. One is that we are worried about forest losses, right? And climate change is leading to more extreme droughts, pests, fires. That's one set of problems. And that is a land management, fire management, fuel management set of issues and solutions. And we have a relatively distinct and separate set of home loss problems or home loss issues. These are not a forest fire problem, but they're really one of where and how we've built our communities. Right? This is a land use and urban planning set of problems. Climate change is making both of these. It's ratcheting up the danger for both of these types of problems. But the solutions to the forest loss problem, we hear about prescribed burning, thinning the forests. We cannot necessarily apply those to the wildland urban interface communities. We can't do prescribed burns through neighborhoods that easily. We can't thin the fuels because often the homes are the fuels in these loss situations. So these are two separate problems with two separate sets of solutions. And I think that's really important to separate that out and to talk about them as such, right? So home loss probabilities really aren't a function of fire behavior in our traditional fire behavior triangle of flame lengths, rates of spread, and intensity. instead, we can take a more risk-based framework. This is out of an IPCC report, and map the hazard, map the fire hazard, but also map where the assets at risk are, what their exposure is, and their vulnerabilities. What year were they built? What kinds of roofs do they have? Et cetera, whatever the risk is that we're worried about. It requires a more nuanced approach to tackling it. So in working in these areas in the last several years, I've become more and more involved in home loss studies and urban planning, and that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about now. Urban planning or land use planning really operates at the scale of an individual building for the most part, right? Building codes and materials. And I often hear, wouldn't stronger building codes solve this problem? Well, it turns out that building codes tend not to apply out at these broader scales about where the home goes on the lot, how the neighborhood is laid out, or where the community is even going to be situated. And so with a colleague, we started looking into this and trying to come up with some best practices of sorts. But home loss studies are also another way we can back into some new knowledge about this. And this is also a housing density related issue. Alex Seifert, a colleague, a few years ago published this work where she and some colleagues broke this out into 3 separate regions and also looked at individual fires in these areas. And what they found was that areas that had destroyed structures during these fires or in these regions are these red bars, right? And time again, places where structure losses were suffered, these were lower density areas. The places where there were no structure losses were consistently higher density areas. And so again, this issue of housing density, it comes back, it affects our fire probability models, and it also affects our home loss probabilities. And so we need to have some better guidance that's not really in our current building codes out at these broader scales to do a better job. This is a lot of text. What I want to do is break it into some subcategories. A colleague and I actually did a bunch of interviews and came up with some risk reduction methods for new communities. And they break out into categories like earlier integration. Get the fire professionals and the land use planners talking together early in the process before all the decisions have actually been made. There's lots that we've learned about siting and layout. I'll show you some examples in a second of communities that would make them less prone to losses, but these are not codified. Redundancies for vulnerable populations. In some parts of the world, they actually have refuges of last resort. If you can't get out during an evacuation, you have a place to go, right? Also water supplies. Lots of places in fires have very deficient water pressure. And something about ignition potential. We focused here on power lines. But some examples of this from our surveys and from the literature review that we did. One really obvious, and this comes from kind of floodplain management, one real obvious thing you can do is to site subdivisions in the lower hazard portions of the landscape. Avoid putting them in the high hazard parts of the landscape and concentrate the development in the lower hazard areas. This is kind of a no-brainer. It actually exists in some building codes. Here's an example from a local plan around here, the Gaviota Coast Plan. Developments shall be sited to minimize exposure, right? Building sites should be in the areas of a parcel's lowest hazard. So that could be codified. That could be a regulation that could help. How would you actually cite those? We have plenty of fire hazard maps that at relatively fine scales that we could have planners and fire professionals, fire marshals using to make these decisions. So another risk reduction measure, concentrate building of homes on the inner side of perimeter roads. Now this is something that a fire marshal told me about. He said, whenever a developer comes in to my shop, I send the plans back and I say, take all of the homes off of that outer perimeter road, pack as many as you can on the inner, and you have now, you don't have fire coming out of the wildlands into people's backyards, right? You have a sidewalk, a full width of a road, another sidewalk of defensible space to use before the fire comes into the community itself. Again, kind of a common sense measure, but not one that's codified or even widely acknowledged amongst planners and fire marshals. Clustering structures, this is also kind of common sense, and this actually meets a bunch of our needs, right? If this is a typical urban sprawl cartoon, here's the far right is the gridded older neighborhood, and as suburban development has happened, we've had these cul-de-sacs and this spread out sparse development. It's eaten up a lot of this darker green native habitat, and it's actually eaten up a lot of this hatched landscape, which is supposed to represent agriculture, right? Well, we could do this differently if we enforced clustered development and had something that's more like this. We preserved a fair amount of the ag, which is actually acting as a buffer in many cases, in many communities against wildfire. And we clustered the same number of homes in these communities. We would have a safer, more defensible, more natural landscape. So this is kind of going against many of the things that we don't like about sprawl, but it's actually safer for fire too if these homes are built to very high fire resistant standards. And many of these are explained in a new publication from a colleague and I that I'm happy to put this in the chat if I can afterwards, if anybody's interested in tracking this down. So yeah, but what about all the communities that are already there? Most of those risk reduction measures are appropriate for new development. But once you have a community laid out on a landscape, you have a lot of the problems kind of baked in to the system, right? You don't have nearly as much flexibility. And one of the tools that many of you are probably aware of is a CWPP, a Community Wildfire Protection Plan, right? And that is a very useful tool. They're more or less contentious depending on the ecosystem you're talking about. In many forests, they're very there's a lot of agreement on them. In many shrublands, on the other hand, they can be quite contentious. But a CWPP, a Community Wildfire Protection Plan, really focuses on where to put your fuel breaks. That's kind of the essence of many CWPPs, is to prioritize where fuel reduction activities should happen on the landscape. But that leaves all of the other fire-related problems in a community generally unaddressed. So I have been advocating for what I'm going to call a regional wildfire mitigation program. And this is an attempt to zoom out and try to handle everything that CWPPs don't. So basically to have three prongs to these types of programs. One is the natural landscape. So assume that fire breaks are going to be on the landscape, and then see if there's agricultural lands that you can lock down or reinstate on some parts of the WUI, the wildland urban interface, because buffers like that are actually very, very effective. It's been very useful in the Santa Barbara area. Ag buffers still exist above Goleta to the west, and Carpinteria and Summerland to the east, but not above Santa Barbara and Montecito anymore. And where do we have our home losses? In Montecito and Santa Barbara. So basically trying to imagine green belts or ways to raise the foliar moisture of some parts of the landscape, some mosaic of buffering types. Could be ag, could be community gardens or orchards, maybe shaded fuel breaks of coast live oaks. Anyway, to look at the landscape, to map it out, to prioritize where we could take those actions and then to implement. The next is the built environment. Structures, primarily mapping and prioritizing what retrofits are needed, but also the other parts of the built environment, the water supplies, the road networks that are problematic during evacuations, the power lines that maybe need to be upgraded. to map, prioritize, and come up with an implementation plan for doing those mitigations. And then the people. I have a project here locally where we're trying to do this, trying to approach these three prongs, these three domains in an integrated way. And that's, in this case, we're gonna educate them through the NFPA Firewise USA program to actually get them educated and trained and plugged into the Firewise program so that the people themselves are retrofitted in a sense and are aware of all of the things that they need to do. So that's, I can talk more about that if you want, but we have a new program here in the Santa Barbara area where we're going to actually pilot this and see how it goes. And hopefully it will, from what we learn here, we'll be able to take and apply in other communities. And I think I'll just end on this note. A lot of what we're talking about here isn't really a California perspective, although sometimes I get accused of that. This paper is from some Forest Service folks who are pretty traditional establishment Forest Service folks talking about the wildland-urban interface and home loss problem. And one of the quotes from this I think is really important and useful because it makes this point. Overcoming perceptions of the wildland-urban interface fire disasters as a wildfire control problem, right? Coming at it from the fire behavior angle, rather than a home ignition problem. That's what we need to do to reduce home losses, right? And so this is not my own soapbox. There's lots of people recognizing that these are really distinct problems with relatively discrete, distinct solutions too. All right, I think that was where I was going to end and open it up to questions. Which I hope there's time for. I actually, yeah, okay.
What I'm going to do is, let's see. We do have one request again for your contact information, if you can go back to that.
Sure.
And then what I'm going to do is start selectively unmuting. So yeah, after we do this, Max, what we're going to need to do I'll call on Gina in just a minute. Thank you, Gina. Let me find you. After we do this, and Gina, about a minute, I'll get to you. Well, I mean, I personally have about 50 questions and I'm going to not say anything. So that was fascinating, but let me see if I can get Gina going here. Hey, Gina, you should be okay now to ask your question.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. This is very interesting. So Dr. Moritz, I wanted to ask you about the Tubbs fire and the devastation in Santa Rosa.
Yeah.
My understanding is that fire pretty much followed the path of a historical fire from around 1954. And of course, in the intervening decades, there were thousands of homes that were built and thousands of homes were burned.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how your modeling explains the 2017 fire, if it does explain it, and what we could expect here in LA regarding historical pathways of fire. I live in Woodland Hills, and apparently there were fires in 1943 and 1944 that burned from Woodland Hills to Malibu. And in the intervening decades, there are thousands of homes in the way.
Yeah.
And it makes one wonder.
It
so
sure
how does
does.
your modeling explain? Yeah.
No, it's a great question. Yeah, I mean, history certainly has a tendency to repeat itself. These wind corridors are they're not new, right? I mean, that's kind of your point. I showed a picture of Santa Ana corridors at one point in the talk, and it was interesting that was one of the first studies where we had actually mapped out parts of the landscape that were hit hard by Santa Anas and other parts that seemed to be sheltered during Santa Anas. And we know there are sundowner winds in the Santa Barbara area. There are Diablo winds up north, around the Bay Area, and we just have very, very limited historical information about those wind patterns, right? We have weather stations here and there. So you have a point, you know, and you might have 10 years of hourly data for that point. But winds vary a lot. I mean, winds vary around in Santa Barbara where I am. We can have sundowners blowing and you could drive 5 minutes on the freeway and the trees go from being bent over to calm, right? The same with Santa Ana's. I've driven during Santa Ana events. You can drive south towards Ventura and it'll be calm in Santa Barbara. It'll be hot. The marine layers stays offshore and it's warmer than it would normally be, but you get to Ventura and boom, your car will be shoved over a lane from the wind. I mean, there's that, it's that heterogeneous. One of the ways those patterns come into the models now is through fire frequencies, right? Assuming that there are going to be ignitions in many of these places, and that's what we're seeing. We're seeing more and more people being sprinkled throughout the landscape. So we have more and more ignitions during those exact, those terrible events. We're starting to see those corridors show up just in the numbers and the sizes of fires. And those we use as inputs to train our models. So where we don't have the actual wind patterns themselves, sometimes the fire patterns act as a good surrogate for those, but not always. And the case of the Tubbs fire is a good one, right? We didn't have very frequent big wind events up in that part of the world. And so our models wouldn't have picked up on that. Thankfully, with the new fire hazard severity zone maps that are coming out from CAL FIRE, as a part of that push, they went back and recreated, to the degree that it was possible, they recreated hourly weather for over a decade. And from that hourly weather, we can now really, not just at where the weather stations are, but in every grid cell, we have modeled patterns that we can now sort through and try to skim off the real extremes, the 99th percentile worst days. We can now make a map of those and actually use those as inputs in our models. So that's kind of the next frontier in that issue. But it's a good question.
So you can raise your hands. And let me see if we have anyone else. Also, there was a question about getting some of your publications that you mentioned. So
Okay.
Is there a place people can go, a standardized place?
Yes, I'm not great at keeping it perfectly updated, but yes, there's a couple of places. Let's see. While somebody's asking a question, I will maybe try to dig that up and put it in the chat window. How's that sound?
You can't put it in chat right now. I would have.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, you're right. Okay.
But
well, I could email them to you and you could send them out.
Yes.
Yeah, maybe that's easiest. But yes, we do. We have a couple of places where we try to keep our publication list updated, and it's all, even though we're probably breaking some rules, we're making them all available to everybody.
Well, we'll send out information afterwards to people on where they can watch this recorded talk, and we'll put it on Facebook too. So, well, one of the things that occurred to me is more political, that people have ideological reasons for seeing certain answers to certain questions. If you're a developer, you might want to see the problem as being fuels management.
Sure.
People, in the way people like to have their houses, I mean, people like to be situated, with a view and open space around them. They feel like they're out in nature. I've certainly been in some homes in let's see, in Topanga and other places that are great, except of course they're just surrounded by fuel. And they'll go fast. So I was just wondering if you might comment on a little bit on the, it's not exactly your field, but you have to entertain it. What's the kind of ideological resistances you run into with various models?
Yeah. It's funny. For a long time, I think people were thinking, developers, for example, or you did get some pushback from rural communities who saw, you know, who see land use planning or urban planning more as, you know, something that's going to control their expansion and maybe reduce their opportunities, right? And I think that one of the arguments that we've tried to use to bring people to the table and find some consensus is that not that many of us are arguing that we need to stop development on all fire-prone landscapes, because that's not really it. That's sort of a non-starter, right? I mean, you know, and California has a real housing problem. We have an affordable housing problem, and so we have to think about smarter ways to build and build according to the constraints of the landscape. So again, if we have a landscape that we want to develop, you know, concentrate that same number of homes if we can on the lowest hazard portions, or lay them out in such a way and cluster them in such a way that you can, you know, maybe you can approximate our housing needs, but just do it smarter. Building smarter, I think, is a big part of what we're advocating. And once people realize that many of us studying this aren't no growth advocates necessarily, we're basically arguing for doing things smarter. I think that tends to ease some of the fears and bring some of the people back to the table. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, that helps a lot. It's just that I think that the way a developer would want to lay out a development is not for maximizing profits and other things. It's not the smart way.
It's not.
People, I mean, we in Sierra Club has an infill policy about, you know, filling in and having higher density in areas, and believe me, we run into lots of resistance to that.
I know.
In areas that are developed, and then you get into areas that are not developed. You know, the idea makes immense sense, right? Buildings that are grouped together don't have flammable material either right around them. It's likely a condo building or things like that. Don't have the kind of room for embers to blow. They're not bigger buildings, are not built to, you know, embers are not going to penetrate. You know, it would make sense to really have high density housing, you know, right around in the furthest distance away from the WUI. I mean,
yeah,
a lot of this makes sense. I was just wondering where you might get the political resistance.
Well, I mean, along those lines, though, there are some examples. There's a community down in Southern California called Rancho Santa Fe, which built itself and touted itself as a shelter-in-place community. They built such that they felt that you wouldn't even have to evacuate when a fire came through. And so, you know, part of this is a perception and expectation and marketing exercise. And also, there's a lot of overlapping goals that are met by more clustered development. You know, maybe you're doing it for the fire related benefits, but it also it has a lighter carbon footprint, and it's easier to get waste, you know, energy to and waste away from these places, and so on. And I think once we start looking at the overlapping benefits of how we're building, I think I'm hoping that will come around. And I'm also hopeful that there will just be some regulations that put some of the science that we've learned into codes, period, right? I mean, we wear seatbelts and helmets, and right? I mean, we do this for their laws, and then we do it for the common good.
Let's see, Sandra, did you have a question?
Yes, I did. Hi, Max. I have a very quick one. Years ago, we were mandated that we had to change the roofs on our homes from the old tile, flammable tiles, to something that was fire resistant.
Okay.
You suggest that we should start looking at replacing siding or venting now with fire resistant materials?
That's a really good question. The vents, yes. So after wood roofs, the vents are widely acknowledged as being the second priority by most. There's not a lot of studies on this yet. It's a relatively young area of study, but in general, Vents are a really good second step because they're not that expensive, right? I mean, if you have attic and crawl space vents, you could do it yourself. You could go out and put 1/8 inch mesh over your existing vents and actually go a long way towards reducing ember intrusion into those existing vents. Or you could buy a new, higher tech ember resistant vent and actually replace your vents. So replacing vents is a good one. Siding is there's even less known about siding. We really don't know how often, for example, embers, blow into a yard, catch the landscaping on fire, and actually ignite the home because of the siding. In general, people talk about homes burning from the inside out. So that implies ember intrusion somehow, getting under a garage door, getting in the attic or the crawl space. So siding, while it's probably a good idea to have non-combustible siding, I don't think we know how good an idea it is, right? But after the roof, there's pretty widespread agreement that it's the vents. But then there's also just human maintenance, right? There's cleaning out your gutters, making sure there's not flammable debris in your leaf gutters during the wrong time of the year, or under the deck, or where your complex roofs, where you have roof angles coming together, tend to be a place where leaves and pine needles and twigs collect, keeping those clear. So kind of the maintenance front is important. And then you could do all that work, and on the wrong day, you could leave and you could leave a window open. Right. So it's the whole, it's living on a fire, it's coexisting with fire. It's living on a fire-prone landscape and being aware of it in all those different ways, which we need to kind of move in that direction.
Thank you. Let me go on to Marianne Ruiz. I thought you texted me, you gave me a question in chat, but I thought we'd let you ask it if you wanted.
Oh, okay. Hi. Yeah, my question is more about the Forest Service and their tree thinning and tree removal plans, such as they've done, in some of our pinyon pine forests, they've basically just mowed them down as a fire prevention method, and touting that as preventing damage to homes and that. It seems to me that that's just harmful to our forests when it's done in the manner that they've done, especially in some of our pinyon pine forests. It doesn't really help with the science of development and planning, which is what we really need. Is it just an excuse to log and cut down forests for development dollars and logging money?
I mean, I think that's a common question and suspicion. There's not a lot of money to be made by removing, let's say, pinyon pine, and so on. There's just not a lot of financial gain in that. When agencies do a fuel treatment, they'll often try to take some of the larger trees, which would be the ones you'd want to leave there. They're probably the most fire resistant trees, really, and they probably have the best habitat value. But these treatments are often expensive, and there's some desire to help make them pay for themselves. So you will sometimes see some trees being taken to make the financial burden of doing a fuels treatment and reducing some hazard more, to reduce that burden. If somebody is clearing a forest or thinning a forest and saying it's going to protect the homes in this town, that's a little bit of a harder argument to make. I think if there are strategically placed fuel treatments around communities, that makes sense. If that's a place where firefighters are actually going to use and to try to put suppression forces there during a fire, that's their job and their expertise. What I think we see sometimes and raise eyebrows over is our fuel treatments out in the just out in the hinterland, right, and arguments that those are going to somehow protect communities, and that's really not a very valid argument.
Thank you. That's what I thought.
And then we'll take one or two more questions. I'll mention one thing though. Of course, we have a unique, well, we were in the minority in California down here where we're located because we really have chaparral environments.
Right.
And so obviously, clearing chaparral is not particularly effective except immediately around, a building or something. And there's great debate whether chaparral can even be overgrown or if that isn't just, a natural condition. And if there's a Santa Ana wind, I mean, like during the station fire, I had a view of it from where I lived. And like on the third day, it just exploded and burned and crossed the entire forest in like half a day.
Yeah.
And there was no human force that could ever have controlled that. And what everyone had to do that was fighting the fire was get out of the way. So, you can direct a fire like that, but it's going to either end where the fuel ends or, at the ocean where the fuel ends if you're in Malibu. So I don't know, any comment on mitigation strategies for environments like the ones we're in?
Yeah, no, I'm in the same kind. Well, the lessons that we've learned a little bit around here in the Santa Barbara area, I've been on the Fire Safe Council for several years now, and I've heard a lot of the older firefighters talking about, again, back in the day when we had more of an ag buffer around the community. So, fire is going to come out of the wildlands. It's going to come out of the shrublands, with 50 to 100 foot flame lengths. It just is, right? But having some sort of buffers between the wildland urban interface and that is one way that we can increase our safety. Stands of coast live oak are actually often pointed to as a nice heat sink and ember blocker. There's not a lot of research on these issues to actually point to say that, this is what we should do. Really, like you're saying, when the conditions are extreme, there's not a lot that you can do other than to reduce your vulnerability, right? You can't reduce the hazard that much under those situations, but you can reduce your vulnerability. You can mitigate the vulnerabilities, like we were talking about, the roofs or the vents, and that's where you can make a big difference. You can greatly increase the chances of your home surviving, even if it is an extreme event.
I think you can even Google various models of what you can do for $1,000 or $5,000 to, I mean, maybe Cal Fire, I don't know who does that.
But people are talking now about exterior sprinklers. You have to have your own water supply because you can't really count on the municipal supply, but you also kind of have to think about timing it, right? You have to make sure that they come on and use that 1,000 gallons or whatever you have when you really want them to. But again, people are talking about it and advocating them, and they probably are a good idea in some cases, but we just haven't tested them that much yet.
So let's see if we have another question or two. The most impressive reaction I saw was to the station fire near Big Tahunga Canyon. Was a couple of concrete homes that have been built. They're literally concrete. There's no wood. So I think they might survive anything. I'm not sure it's going to be popular, but
I don't think we have to go to that extreme either. I mean, I don't think we have to live in bunkers. I think you could imagine having a safe, a refuge on your property somewhere that was a small bunker, but I don't think we have to build like that. We just have to be smarter about the way we, get rid of the vulnerabilities that we have been building into our neighborhoods.
Well, to me, the higher density argument within a development is a large area actually that's being developed is something that's relatively new to me. So that's actually that's a fascinating point you make about it.
It's fairly new even amongst firefighters. Like firefighters have a knee-jerk reaction against that because they think of homes igniting other homes if they're close together. But if we are building these homes in very fire-resistant construction materials and methods, then having them close together, they're much easier to defend. Yeah.
Well, let me see if we have one last question here. We'll give Sandra another chance if you wanted to ask a question, Sandra.
Yeah, Max, you just mentioned about having sprinkler systems, but that you would need your own water source. I'm out in the Santa Clarita area, and we've had problems here with people who have their own water source, that they're on wells, that in extreme fire, they cut off the electricity so that you don't have access to your water. And we had a lot of damage in recent
Okay.
fire, not because the fire was so overwhelming, but because they couldn't put out little embers because they didn't have water because their electricity had been turned off.
Yeah. Well, I guess when I was imagining people having their own water, I was thinking of a 1 or 2 or 5,000 gallon tank above ground. Because you're right, if you don't have electricity, you need a generator, yeah, and a pump. But I think that that's not uncommon. That in a lot of fire situations, once homes burn, you get a lot of broken pipes and you get a lot of geysers, and you have a lot of water, a lot of demand on the water supply. And during extreme events, actually, the municipal water supply often drops in pressure quite a bit. So I guess what I was just thinking is if you're going to put a lot of dollars and hopes into an exterior sprinkler system, I think you might go the extra mile and get a few thousand gallons of water in a water tank locally too.
In some
And,
places, LA County has actually required those
Uh-huh.
tanks.
Yeah.
I don't know where. Well, we thank you very, very much. This was fascinating, and I know it got all of us thinking about the variables in both fire, in wildfire, in new ways. And we really, really appreciate it, Max.
You're very welcome, and I appreciate the opportunity. So get
And
in
we'll
touch if you need to.
And we'll post links and other things on
Okay.
Facebook.
I put some in the chat. I was able to actually chat to everybody. I don't know if that worked, but
I think it just comes to me, but I'll also get a copy of chat
Sure.
afterwards, so I can post that too.
okay, sounds good.
So thanks again, everybody.
Yeah, thank you all.
Have a good evening.
Yep, you too.